Welcome back, everybody. Today we are looking at a chess game that has just recently happened, and it has taken the world of chess by complete surprise. This is Alisher Suleymanov versus Magnus Carlsen, and Magnus, with the black side, loses to a 2500 rated grandmaster. Obviously an incredible player, but just to put this into context, the last time that Magnus has lost to a player of 2500 rating skill was in 2006, 17 years ago. This doesn't really happen. Like, Magnus is just at a different level than these 2500 rated grandmasters. And to lose, especially in the form that he lost here, I mean, he just got completely outplayed. And so this is an extremely rare occurrence, and I definitely want to delve into it. So with the white side, again, 2500 rated Alisher Suleymanov, Magnus employs sort of a Nimzo setup against the d4 c4 setup opening for white. And one thing to kind of keep in mind, Magnus goes for this theoretical setup, but it does end up wasting time. He goes bishop a6 to drag the queen to c2, forcing it to defend the pawn, because you don't really want to go e3 and lock this dark square bishop in too early. So bishop a6, queen c2, and now bishop e7, dropping the bishop right back. So wasting time like this seems a little surprising, but the claim that black is making is that the queen is misplaced, and it prefers to be on d1, where it prepares an eventual d5. Now, admittedly, the queen on c2 looks very fine to me. I mean, it's very typical for the queen to come here. One of the benefits is that it supports the very quick e4, and in fact, we see this happening immediately. So the queen on c2 is certainly not bad, but still black made this claim that it would have wanted to be on d1, and that does make a little bit of sense, especially with c5 coming. Notice that d5 is a little less appetizing because the queen is already on c2. And so instead e4 is played, and here after takes, knight takes, bishop c5, and the first surprising move, and maybe this is kind of what threw Magnus a little off guard, he played knight f3, which is very surprising. Knight b3 is the more typical, more theoretical continuation, gaining immediate tempo on the bishop. And one of the ways that this position can develop is, for example, knight c6, letting the opponent take, but after bishop e3, this pawn actually serves as a clamp on the dark squares, so knight d4 can come, right? And eventually it could even be supported by e5 if necessary. So this is one of the common ways that this position develops, but instead white went knight f3. Again, kind of surprising. The benefit, though, it's no longer obstructing the b pawn, so b4 is coming. So after knight c6, b4. And so this sideline of the opening is perhaps something that Magnus did not cover with enough detail, because after knight d4, black is completely fine. This is the main move. This is what Magnus should have gone for. The idea being, after the queen moves, let's say, to d3 or d2, which doesn't really matter, we have a trade on f3, and then the bishop drops back. And you don't want to first start with dropping the bishop back. You want to first include this trade, because here white has extra space, and so black is a little cramped, and generally trading pieces from a cramped position is a strong strategical approach. And so the premature bishop e7, instead of first going for the trade, is a little bit strange, and it does give white the space and the pieces to utilize that space, especially after bishop e2. White here is in the driver's seat. That much is apparent. And queen b8 is a move that really illustrates that. I mean, this is such a passive move. You'd like to go queen c7. Obviously, that runs into some issues. Queen b8 does control the dark squares. It does allow black to castle and then activate the rook onto the queen side. But it is very passive, and you look at the rook on a8, and you just wonder what it's doing there. So rook d1 is the response. Very natural. Centralizing the rook. We have castles, bishop e2, d6, castles. Everything here makes sense. Both players developing. Rook to c8, rook to e1, bishop f1, super strong move by white. You can see that white is just not doing anything special. They're not touching these pawns yet. They're just developing, centralizing all their pieces, moving the bishop out of way to control this e-file a little bit further. And it's working wonders, because black is completely cramped and white is not giving them the luxury of an escape by pushing prematurely one of these pawns. So knight e7. And here, the idea is clear. You want to open up the rook, you want to open up your pieces, maybe reroute the knight to the king side, but it does come with a very significant downside, which is the fact that the bishop now disconnects its control to d6. So knight to b5 takes advantage of that immediately. Now the question is back at black. How do you want to defend? This is extremely passive, of course, but you know, there's not much better. I mean, in the game, knight e8 was played. Look at how passive this is. You might be wondering, why can't the knight just continue its path to g6? This is possible, but after bishop takes, the structure gets a little bit spoiled. And here, like queen d2, and there's still the issue of the d6 pawn. So instead of all of this, knight to e8 was played, not giving white the ability to take. But again, look at how passive this is, right? You already have one rook that's not in the game, a queen that is very questionable, and now the knight is also returning back from a far more active post. This is the sign for white. Now is the time to launch an attack, and that is exactly what white does. Knight to g5, with very rude intentions in mind, right? Like ideas of e5 with queen h7 are definitely in white's in white's head, and specifically this idea is one that black needs to address. Now, obviously, moving these pawns to stop that is very passive. It weakens the position further. So knight g6 is kind of the most flexible and natural move. But here e5 comes anyways, and the idea is really nice. If you take, then after bishop takes, you can't take this one because of mate, right? And if you take with the queen, obviously you just lose your queen with rook takes. So the queen's actually trapped. Again, taking advantage of the incredibly poor coordination between black's heavy pieces. Knight c7 is possible. You don't lose the queen, at least not yet. But after rook d7, it doesn't look glamorous, really. I mean, time to start a new game, I think. So after e5, instead of taking, Magnus recognizes the issue, and he goes d5. And he claims that he's okay for now, right? The bishop is now actually locked. It's not clear exactly where the pressure comes, and in fact, this rook is exerting some pressure of black's own right on the queen side. So how do you continue? Well, Alisher finds a very nice way, queen b3, simply sidestepping the c-file pressure. Potentially, ideas of swinging the queen over to the king side become possible. The knight here is a great attacker, especially if it is complemented by a queen. And another idea is to just blast open this diagonal. Look at how juicy these light squares in the center are, right? White has just an abundance of pressure on all of these light squares, and so adding the queen as well, that could be the end. And indeed, I am foreshadowing a little bit, because after bishop e7, knight f7, bam, the light squares are over. I mean, black has nothing better than to take the knight. I mean, at least force white to prove their win. But the proving here is not too difficult. After takes, bishop takes was played, but now rook takes d5, queen takes, and like I said, blasting open the queen side, and the king is just left completely undefendable. I mean, king f8 is forced, but now a beautiful maneuver with this knight to get the knight to an attacking aggressive post, knight to d4 to e6, and it's already game over. I mean, there's nothing you can do. You have to stop the move of knight e6, otherwise there's that very typical pattern of mate that will appear with knight f7, knight f6, queen g8. So you have to stop that, but it's not easy. If you go knight c7, then after queen f3, king g8, knight c6, game over. The queen is actually trapped because of this tactic here. So you can't defend it with that knight. If you defend it with this knight by knight f4, this is indeed what Magnus played, but after queen f3, the knight is lost. And indeed, after king to g8, queen takes, you know, black tried to hold on for a couple more moves, but it's really not easy. And after bishop c4, knight h6, finally, Magnus threw in the towel because of obvious reasons. The bishop's attacked. If you take, this is mate. If you don't take, the knight is coming to f7 with some devastating attack. It's incredibly difficult, and it's just completely losing and busted for black. Now, before we wrap up the video, I do want to point out a couple things. This looks like a really smooth game, and largely, I mean, it is, because black really just made a couple of significant mistakes that allowed white to just cruise through this position. But I do want to point out two things. First of all, there were still very serious decisions that white had to make, right? Like knight f7 is not a move you play easily, especially not against Magnus Carlsen. And similarly here, finishing off the game is sometimes one of the hardest steps, because you have very often an abundance of options, right? Like this maneuver seems very intuitive, but also like rook e3, rook f3 seems logical. Maybe you throw in the check first. Maybe h4, h5 comes. Now, all of these moves win, but the extent to which they win is different, and it would be a lot harder to convert. For example, after h4 or after rook e3, black has a lot better defensive resources. So finding exactly how to tighten the screws and finish the game is very often a task that goes a little unnoticed, right? You don't give it enough credit, but indeed it's an important part of converting the game. Now, the final thing I want to mention, where did black mess up? Because it doesn't seem so obvious. I mean, the opening stage was highly theoretical, but I think first of all here, going knight d4 was definitely to be preferred. This bishop e7 is just passive, and again, white has now the pieces to continue launching an attack. Now, secondly, I think that in this position, after knight g6 and e5, one of the big mistakes here was pushing, because this allowed, like I mentioned, queen b3, and now because you pushed, the light squares are just totally vulnerable. They're like a hook that white can utilize. What you should have done as black is gone bishop e7 and immediately questioned the knight, which is largely giving white all of their attacking possibilities. Now, this again looks scary, and after takes and d7 comes, it's not easy to go for this, especially with c5 on the way. But the truth is, this is more of a double-edged position than what we got in the game. Because although, yes, c6 is coming, white does have dark square control and the d-file, still, after a move like takes and bishop c6, there's a lot of conversion that needs to happen. This is anyone's game. White is to be preferred, that's for sure, but still black is holding on, and with Magnus, I would trust him to be able to hold this. If not, honestly, go for more. It is Magnus after all. So this would have been better. And the final point that I want to mention here after takes, instead of taking with the bishop, it was slightly better to take with the pawn. Now, you might be wondering, does this not just transpose? Well, it is going to transpose if they take, but they don't take, and they sidestep with king to f8. And here again, Magnus has slightly better chances. Admittedly, knight d4, knight e6 is still coming. Again, if you take, we just transpose. So black's best option here is not to take, and in fact claim that the rook is sort of awkwardly discoordinating the connection between the knight and the queen that is so crucial to this attack. But it's not a very strong claim, and at some point white can even just sack the rook and then go for that same mate that I was outlining earlier with queen to g8 in the end. So this is not going to end well for black either, but it would have been at least a bit more of an interesting defensive try. But ultimately, I mean, white just had a very smooth game, and it was really interesting, and I wanted to make sure, if you haven't seen this game already, I definitely wanted to show you this because of how rare it was, but also just because of how beautiful of an attacking game this was. Thank you so much for watching. Subscribe if you're new around here. Like the video if you learned something new from it, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.